DCC decoders have limits in terms of the level of power they can handle before succumbing to catastrophic failure. The threshold will vary between different types of decoder. So what are those power levels? How can a locomotive end up drawing such levels? And how can you mitigate the risk of decoder destruction on your layout? It's time to take a closer look. Thanks for joining today's video. We'll start by looking at the voltage and current that makes up the power consumed by a DCC decoder, including the limits for some of the most popular decoder types. We'll then look at the factors that can lead to excessive power draw in a locomotive and how this can ultimately lead to failure. Finally, we'll look at how you can mitigate against overdriving your decoder and hopefully avoiding its ultimate destruction. For a DCC-based layout, the voltage will remain more or less constant, so it's the current value that drives the power consumed, and ultimately the temperature of the decoder and its ultimate failure if that temperature becomes too high. Manufacturers typically specify two figures in relation to the maximum level of current a decoder can handle. The first is the continuous current level, which is the maximum level of continuous current draw supported over a number of minutes, hours, or even days. The second is the value of peak current that can be tolerated for a limited time span, which is typically no more than 10 to 20 seconds. So let's take a look at the manufacturer's specifications for some of the most commonly used decoders out there. These numbers are for typical 00 gauge decoders. Figures for smaller form factor decoders, including those targeted at smaller scales, will be lower, and those for larger scales will be correspondingly bigger. The message here is to make sure you understand your decoder's specified limits so that you can take that into account in how you use your decoder. We'll stick to the 00 gauge targeted decoders for this particular video, but all the principles we discussed today can equally be applied to any scale. So all the figures on this chart are in milliamps, and so we'll start with the Hornby TTS decoders, and these are actually the most problematic because of their relatively low maximum continuous motor current, which is showing there as 500 milliamps. They've got a peak of 1000 milliamps, so you can run these at 1000 milliamps for a number of seconds without actually destroying the decoder. So if you've got a means of monitoring the current draw on one of these decoders, this gives you the kind of threshold where you'll need to take action if you see the value go above the 500 milliamp mark. They also quote a total current consumption figure, and this includes both the motor and any of the accessories. So all of the aux connections that you have, driving your lights, or any other accessories that are on the locomotive. Next up, we've got the Hornby TXS decoders, and the good thing about these is that their continuous figure is twice that of the TTS decoders. So obviously Hornby did recognize that they needed to increase that number because the 500 milliamp number is small. You've got a bit more leeway with the TXS decoders, which is good news, and then the max peak current for those is 1500. Gives you a little bit more leeway. It isn't quite maybe the same ratio as you got with the TTS decoders, but still it's good to have that extra leeway there if you see some problems with the current increasing on your TXS decoder. And they quote a total figure, which includes all of your accessories plus your motor, of 1000 milliamps. Now let's get into the Loxon 5 decoder. And here we can see that we've got again a bigger number for the max continuous current draw in the motor. And this is coming in at 1.5 amps, 1500 milliamps. And so this is the largest that we have on the chart here. So obviously this is going to allow you to drive larger locomotives with much larger rakes and potentially up much larger inclines as well. And we'll talk about all those factors in the next section. It's also got a peak value of 3 amps, 3000 milliamps. So that again gives you plenty of leeway if things start to go awry and you see the value creeping up dramatically. You do have some time to take some action to maybe cut the power in your circuit and protect your decoder if you do see the current entering into a kind of a runaway condition. They don't specify the total max continuous, which would be the combination of the motor plus the accessories. So really we are a little bit in the dark. They do specify the maximum numbers for the different aux connectors. They do provide maximums for those, but not a total number, which is all of those ports together combined with the motor. So I would tend to be sticking to that 1.5 amp figure for the entire decoder when you're actually running it, and I don't think I'd be looking to go much further than that. So it's important to look at the Loxon 5 micro decoder, which has a substantially lower threshold for current consumption, which is half that of its larger version. So you really want to be a bit careful here if you are running with the microdecoders on larger locomotives with large rakes, etc. Last on the list, I've put one of the representative Zemo decoders. And again, you've got a pretty healthy 1200 milliamp figure there for the continuous running of the motor. And you've got 2.5 milliamps if you actually want to look at a short-term peak value. Again, they didn't specify the combination of the motor plus all the aux ports on the decoder. So again, I would be kind of limiting myself to that 1200 milliamp number in terms of the total current draw on this particular decoder before you're starting to run into potential problems. So now let's look at the factors that will impact the amount of current that a particular decoder will draw. The first of these I'm going to look at are what I call the predictable factors. So these are things you can pretty well predict beforehand and you have a level of control over. So it's up to you to actually manage most of the items on this particular slide. In the next one, we'll look at the items that are not predictable and will be kind of unknowns to you. And we'll talk about those in due course. The first thing here is the locomotive weight. You can feel that the locomotive is heavy and you can obviously measure its weight. And I typically include this in any of my locomotive reviews because it is important, particularly at the low end and also at the very high end. And very large, very heavy locomotives can be problems in themselves because of the actual weight in the locomotive. And there is probably a kind of a happy ground in between where you're getting a lot of good traction from the weight, but the weight isn't excessive in terms of impacting the actual motor and impacting the current drawn by the motor. The other factor here is inclines, and if you do have a lot of weight in your locomotive, well then when you're running on an incline, you will see the current actually increase more than if you're just running on the straight. So the incline has a kind of a multiplier factor there. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on this slide. The next one I want to talk about is running resistance of your rolling stock. So if you're running things like Mark III or Mark IV coaches from Hornby, for example, they have very low running resistance. So this is never going to be a problem if you're running that type of rolling stock. The problems arise typically with freight wagons that have medium to high levels of resistance. And this resistance can increase on curves as well. So while you may be running, say, okay on the straight, when you go into a curve, you may see your running resistance go up and your current consumption go up as a result. The next item is the weight of the rolling stock. And if you've got a very low running resistance and if you're running on the straight, well then the weight doesn't really make a huge amount because very little effort is required to actually move those wagons or coaches if you're running on the flat. Where the weight of the rolling stock kicks in is when you're on inclines. And that's where you'll start to see the current increase in proportion to the incline and the actual weight of the rolling stock. Next one is the size of the train. And again, if you've got all very low running resistance rolling stock and you're running on the flat, well then you can run with a very large train size. However, if you start to have medium to high resistance stock and you're running on an incline as well, you're going to see problems and you may have to curtail your train size if you're running on something like a TTS decoder, for example, because you don't want to exceed that 500 milliamp threshold. The last two items on the list here, the inclines on your layout and the actual speed that you run the train at, these are multiplier factors, as we've kind of already indicated. So these aren't additive, these are going to multiply the combination of the other factors that we've gone through previously. Hence, they do have a very big impact potentially on your current capacity. Now, the power curves for every locomotive are different, and some locomotives will draw low amount of current at a low speed and increase proportionally. But that's not typical. Typically, there is a kind of a value that locomotives will draw. And even when you increase the speed, they don't tend to draw an awful lot more current. They have a kind of a baseline that they kind of get to. And even with increasing speed, they won't draw an awful lot more current. That changes, of course, when you add rolling stock or when you add inclines. It does vary. But I guess the important point here, and this is where you're going to have a control point on your layout. You can control a lot of these items. You can't control the weight of the locomotive, or you can't control the running resistance, but you can measure them and you can have a good idea as to what they are. Similarly with the actual weight of the rolling stock. And the things you can control are your inclines, you can control the size of your train, and you can control the speed at which you're actually running the train. And you can choose to run at lower speeds, for example, if you see that you're heading up over the threshold when you're running the train at a high speed. So you can knock down the speed a little bit or take away some of the rolling stock to run with a smaller train. and get yourself within the threshold for your decoder. Okay, let's move to the other predictable factors, as I call them. And these again are things that you know they're there. They're a feature on the locomotive, like a rotating fan, like a steam or smoke generator, also the lighting features that you have on the locomotive. And typically you will see somewhere in the documentation, you will get indications as to what the sort of current draws are for each of these individual items. Typically today, the impact of LED-based lighting means that the lighting features actually don't consume a lot of current in the overall scheme of things, even if you've got coach lighting, etc. The numbers tend to be in the single digits of milliamps or in the low tens of milliamps as a worst case. The things that take a lot of current or potentially can take current are the rotating fans and things like the steam and smoke generators. It'll be important to keep an eye out for the exact specification for the current draw for those particular elements on your locomotive if they do support these features. And then you'll be able to add that into the overall total to get an idea of what you're going to be drawing. The last category here is what I'm calling the unpredictable factors. So these are things you're just not going to know about, and they're going to come up in the course of actually testing out the locomotive itself, or perhaps in the course of the running session when you're actually running with rolling stock and running up inclines, etc. And in general, these tend to be problems with the locomotive or problems with the rolling stock. So the first item here is just the actual characterization of the motor itself. And you're typically not going to know that. So even within a particular locomotive type from a vendor, due to batch variances, or perhaps they had to source a different motor from a different vendor, that's going to introduce differences. So while you might have a typical value, say take for a Bachmann class 66, for example, you might say, oh, well, they typically draw 150 milliamps. That may not be the case, because even the exact same part number of a locomotive produced at a different time with a different batch of motors is going to have a different current draw. You're only going to discover this when you put that new locomotive on the track and actually start running it and monitoring the actual current drawn by that locomotive against different speeds. Now the next 4 items I'm going to talk about are problems. So these are defects in the product. First of these is motor problems, and these can be electrical or mechanical issues. These could be issues with the component itself, or they could be issues with the way the motor has been implemented or the way the manufacturing process has actually installed the motor in your locomotive. There's kind of 3 main factors that are going to tell you if you've got a problem with your motor. One, that the motor actually runs as you would expect it to. As you increase the power, you get a corresponding increase in speed of the motor. So that's one thing. Second thing is noise. Are you hearing any noises that you wouldn't expect to hear as you increase the speed of that motor? And the last thing is the actual current being drawn. Motor may appear to be running okay, but you may see that it's actually consuming an awful lot of current, an awful lot more current than you would expect it to draw. So I typically put the current value into my reviews, and that's the current value for a properly working locomotive. So that at least gives you a representative view, a ballpark view as to what to expect. As I say, there will be variations based on batch, there'll be variations based on manufacturing process and installation, but at least you'll have something to work off. Next item is gear train problems, and this is typically due to things like dirt or debris in the manufacturing process getting into the gear train. Typically result in noise, it'll result in poor performance. There may be an issue with lubrication, or just the gear train was not installed correctly, and that's possible as well. So these are the sort of things you'll get, and these can manifest themselves in terms of increased current consumption on your locomotive. Next one is a high resistance fan, and I had first-hand experience of this with a class 43 HST from a number of years ago. They did have rotating fan. Belt was driven off the main motor with a very high resistance, and I ended up blowing up a TTS decoder as a result when running at high speed. There's a number of things that can be in play here, and it does depend on the actual implementation. So, different fans are implemented in different ways. But things like contamination, issues with the bearings, lack of lubrication, or wear and tear, if you've had the locomotive for a period of time, can all lead to problems with the fan. So typically here, things that you'll kind of recognize with the fan is, one, is it rotating, or is it rotating at any reasonable speed that it should be rotating at? Is it making a noise? And when you have the fan connected and turned on, are you seeing excessive current drawn? So it's pretty well the same things that you consider for the motor. There's no surprise because there's a motor in there for the fan. And these are the things to watch for with the fan. The last one there, and this is one that again, I've had past experience of, and I know other people in the comments have had, the control PCB that you have on your locomotive, which houses the decoder socket and houses all the connections, electrical connections across the motor. If there's issues with that, there could be component failures on there, bad capacitor, for example, a shorted diode. There could be soldering issues, there could be shorts, there could be damaged traces that were damaged during the manufacturing process. Again, the sort of problems you'll see here is poor running performance, things like your lighting isn't working, or again, excessive current draw. I think the summary from this particular chart is all of these items can impact the current draw on the decoder, and they can typically impact them in a very negative way. You're talking about 500, 900, 1000 milliamps of extra current being drawn in the locomotive. So straight away you can see that's going to blow up a TTS decoder, it's going to potentially blow up a TXS decoder, and worst case you can actually blow up your ESU type decoder, the full-size ESU decoders. People in the comments have actually given me input that they have blown up those decoders because of issues like these. So really one of the purposes of making this video is to kind of highlight the types of issues that you can detect that you've got a problem if you're looking at the actual current measurements in the first place. So how can you mitigate against overdriving your decoder and hopefully avoiding its ultimate destruction? The DCC Concepts alpha meter provides a way to accurately measure either DCC or DC current on your layout. I use it every day now to monitor current consumption and to check out the integrity of new locomotives I add to the layout. I quote the current measurements it provides in my locomotive reviews, and I've also used the numbers it's given me when engaging with manufacturers on potentially faulty models. It's probably the single most important tool I've used to avoid DCC decoder burnout on my layout, and I haven't had a decoder failure since purchasing it, despite having some faulty locomotives that would have likely caused me problems if I wasn't able to monitor their current draw. For the price of a Hornby TXS decoder, this has to be one of the best investments I ever made, and it has helped me no end in dealing with issues on new locomotives in particular, and ultimately saved me a lot of time and a lot of grief. With a current limit of 10 amps, the alpha meter should work for very large layouts, including larger scales. If you run DCC on your layout, then I would describe a tool like this as essential, whether it's the DCC Concepts device or the RR amp meter that used to be available a few years ago and can still be found from a number of retailers. Unfortunately, manufacturers don't quote the typical current levels their locomotives will consume, so when selecting a decoder, you're going to need to measure this yourself, and then start adding in the rolling stock to get a feel for whether you're ultimately going to be able to stay within the operational boundaries of your decoder with some margin to spare, or need to look at a different decoder. So how much margin, you may ask? First of all, running your decoder at its upper limits on an ongoing basis for hours and days is going to stress your decoder and will ultimately shorten its life, whereas only running close to the limits for short time periods, measured in minutes, will help minimize that stress. My guidance would be to give yourself a 20 to 25% margin over the manufacturer's figures. If an early life decoder failure does occur, then you'll be able to go back to the decoder manufacturer with a much stronger case than if you've been driving it to its limits all of the time. So for example, if I'm running my HST with a TTS decoder and I see the current pushing above 400 milliamps on a continuous basis, I'll be faced with the choice of reducing the speed or taking off some cars until the current dropped to less than the 400 milliamp level. Alternatively, I'd need to look at an alternative decoder such as a TXS or ESU decoder. If you're always running with long rakes at prototypical maximum scale speeds, then you're always going to be sailing close to the wind with a TTS decoder. Add in some inclines and heavier rolling stock, and you're almost definitely going to need to look at a more powerful decoder, preferably before you burn out any of the TTS decoders you have. As mentioned earlier, excessively high currents of greater than 500 milliamps for a locomotive on its own are indicative of a locomotive problem, be it the motor, a fan, gear train, or control PCB, or potentially a compromised decoder that is already well on its way to catastrophic failure. Okay, so in summary, I kind of want to highlight 4 points. First of all, DCC decoder failures can and will occur due to overload conditions associated with your train and/or layout configuration and/or defects in your locomotive. Number 2, For more stressful configurations, you should always use a decoder that has a higher current rating, or alternatively cut back on those things like the train length and the running speed that you have control over. Thirdly, use something like a DCC Concepts alpha meter to monitor the current consumption of your locomotives. And this can be an absolute lifesaver and give you good clues into whether you've got a problem with your configuration that you can control, whether the problem is actually a defect in the locomotive and you need to be going back for a warranty repair. And that brings me to the last point. You should always look to measure the current draw for newly purchased locomotives. Under speed and under load. You need to do both. And here what you want to do is identify any potential out-of-the-box problems, any of those issues I covered in some of the earlier slides that may require a repair return under warranty. As I mentioned in the video, I've blown 2 TTS decoders in the past myself, purely because I unknowingly overloaded them. Other viewers have fed back in the comments that they've had blown ESU decoders as a result of defects on their locomotives, which is always a possibility. If you've had similar experiences, please let us know in the comments. Blowing a decoder is never a nice experience, so I hope this video has helped you better understand the primary reason for decoders failing and can help you avoid destroying any decoders of your own in the future. So thanks for joining today. Please drop a like if you found this video of use, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one. In the meantime, take care and happy modeling.